Welcome to Run Long, Run Healthy, where every week my co-host Brady Homer and I usually dissect something interesting in the world of run science and explain it in a way that regular runners like ourselves can apply it to our running and lives. Today, we're addressing what we are considering perhaps a foundational topic of running. We're going to discuss rate of perceived exertion. And I'll just jump straight in. Brady, can you explain to us what RPE actually is and why maybe despite all the metrics we get from our wearables these days, why a subjective or intuitive measure like RPE is still so popular and useful?
Simply put, RPE, rating of perceived exertion, is just a measure or your own rating of how hard exercise is. So in this case, how hard running is. If you were out on a run and someone were to ask you, hey, how hard does this feel? Your RPE is a rating of how hard that is based on effort. And as you mentioned, it is subjective rather than objective, meaning it's not something that's coming from your watch. It's not your heart rate. It's not your lactate level, but it is, how does this feel to me? How hard does this feel to me? And just because it's subjective, I think we'll touch upon this, does not mean that it is any less valid. Perhaps it might be even more valid than some of these objective metrics that you and I have covered in a previous podcast, like heart rate, lactate, power output, all of these, dozens and dozens of data points that we have. It's a rating of how hard you think running is, and it's probably one of the oldest and most used measures of effort and exercise intensity.
And I think we can mention now, we did mention it in our running metrics show a few weeks ago, but Alex Hutchinson put out a pretty good article where he dissected this paper, basically where they did a study that compared some general metrics for fatigue against just asking the runners how fatigued they were using a NASA study. And basically the results of the study or the subjective questionnaire were more accurate than what the wearables were telling them. Is that it in a nutshell?
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. Essentially, the participants in the study, they completed a variety of different types of exercise, some long duration, high intensity, some short duration, high intensity, some long duration, low intensity, and so on. And then they took several different training stress scores. If people use platforms like Strava or Training Peaks or even an app like Garmin or Coros, typically after a run, after a workout, it'll give you a stress score. And basically that integrates how long the workout was, what your heart rate was, what your pace was, and it'll give you just this training stress score. A lot of different ones are used. And so they calculated the stress score for all of these different workouts, but then they also gave these participants this NASA questionnaire. It's had, I think it was 6 questions, all related to just subjective effort. How hard was that? I can't exactly off the top of my head recall what the specific questions are, but 6 of them related to basically rating of perceived exertion. It was a subjective questionnaire. And then they compared, did the NASA questionnaire predict the recovery or the reductions in performance after the workout the next day or the same day? Or did these training stress scores better predict it? And it turns out the NASA questionnaire, their ratings on that almost aligned perfectly with how hard these workouts were in terms of the performance decrement that they led to. And the training stress scores, in fact, almost completely predicted the opposite. Like the easiest workout based on the training stress score actually produced the highest performance decrement and vice versa. So they were next to useless, whereas this NASA questionnaire, which simply asked them 6 easy things about related to their rating of perceived exertion, was very good at predicting the stress, the actual stress of the workout.
And I think that's interesting because when you first hear about this concept, it's easy to assume that it's so subjective that everybody's going to give a mixture of responses, and it might not be too accurate in actually measuring how fatigued somebody is. But yeah, there's actually some pretty good literature that shows it's as good or if not more reliable than the best metrics we've got right now. So we're going to run through briefly the development of the RPE scale, and we can run through, I think, what we're considering our favorite RPE scale. And we can also talk a bit maybe about some like RPE hacks. But I'm interested because I really like using RPE, and I've used it usually when I'm training, but not training for a time goal, but just following another training program. So I'm interested, Brady, what's your experience using RPE? Is it something you use day to day? Is it something you're using when you're training for a specific goal, or do you just ignore it and follow your Garmin all the time?
I think personally, I use RPE, but somewhat unofficially during most of my training runs. I would say, unless I'm doing an interval workout where I'm really trying to stick to a particular pace or perhaps a power output, I'm using RPE, but it's sort of in the back of my head, and I think that's what how a lot of runners probably use RPE. You know, I head out for a run. Today's supposed to be easy, so I know if I'm using, say, a 1 to 10 scale, which we'll talk about soon, this should be a 5 maybe, or a 6. And I'm not. I mean, sometimes I do, and I think that runners can do this, but I'm not really saying out loud, "This is a 5," while I'm during my run. But in the back of my head, this should feel like a 5. This is like, half of what an all-out effort would feel like. So I think in the back of my head, subconsciously, I am using RPE to prescribe most of my sessions in one way or another. Maybe that doesn't mean this needs to be a 5 out of 10, but maybe this needs to be easy on an easy, moderate, and hard scale. So I'm kind of using all of these different ways, these different effort ratings without officially using a scale to sort of prescribe my runs. And that's most of the time. I think for most experienced runners, RPE is very valid because you're in tune with your body. You've logged enough training runs and training miles to know what easy feels like, what moderate, and what hard feels like. But I also use it, I would say, to prescribe, if I have somebody who I'm coaching or if somebody is just asking me about what intensity this run should be. I actually do use RPE quite a bit. Rather than telling them run in zone 2, which if people don't know what their zone 2 is next to useless. What are you basing it on? Heart rate, basing it on lactate. You just say, yeah, this should be a 7 or 8 out of 10. And most people know what that means. They really do. And I think especially runners who tend to be in tune with their bodies, what a 7 out of 10 feels like. What a 10 out of 10 feels like, or a 3 out of 10. And so I use it a lot when telling people, this should be the intensity of your workout rather than prescribing them, say, a specific pace or a specific heart rate.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I like it so much and have always defaulted to it is it's a reliable measure of your performance, but intrinsic in RPE, it accounts for all the internal and external variables that might be happening on one day. So let's say you've got a 10K route next to your house and you try and run it at the same pace every day. No two runs are identical because on different days, the temperature is different. Basically, you've got external conditions that are different. Temperature, weather, the time of day, maybe you mix up the terrain. Then you've got internal conditions that are completely different every day, whether it's your how well you've slept, whether it's your motivation or willpower that day, it's your fueling, it's your hydration, the time of day you run. And it can be very hard to try and sort of account for all those through some kind of algorithm or some kind of wearable metric, whereas RPE basically takes all that into account inherently. So if you're going for a trail run, obviously you're going to be a lot slower, but if you just stick to RPE, you're basically going to be maintaining a consistent exertion level. Whereas if you're trying to follow what might be on your watch, you can get in all kinds of mess.
Yeah, I think, Thomas, what you just said is probably one of the most maybe misunderstood, but also like one of the most important points about RPE is that it's not just some random number generator that you're, picking out of your head and saying out loud. If you think about what informs your RPE or how hard you think something is, well, yeah, if it's 90 degrees outside and I'm automatically hot when I step out for my run, well, I'm going to start that run. It's going to be harder when I start. My rating of that run is going to be harder. If I'm stressed out, or like you said, someone didn't sleep well, the effort for the same pace is going to be harder. So if someone were to, I want to do a zone 2 run today, my typical zone 2 run is 7.5 minutes per mile. Well, if I only got 4 hours of sleep, it's 100 degrees out and 80% humidity, and perhaps I skipped breakfast, well, that 7.5 minute mile pace, that might feel insanely hard that day. And if the goal of the session is to be easy based on your rating of perceived exertion, then you need to go on RPE versus trying to force a faster pace that might lead to a higher RPE. So yeah, it's integrating all of these signals, physiological, psychological, environmental, and that's what's informing your RPE. It's not just, the tension in my muscles and that's how hard it feels. No, your body is really informing, relaying these signals to your brain, outputting the RPE that eventually is what you say your RPE is. But it is, I think we should think of it as a physiological measure as much as we should a psychological measure.
Yeah, agreed. And so I think that covers why it's better than just, let's say, blindly trying to stick to a predetermined pace. But I think we can even compare it to running based on RPE versus running on heart rates and your heart rate zones. And I think we can make a pretty solid argument for saying RPE beats that too, because there are some limitations with heart rate zone training in terms of, let's say, very deconditioned runners. Their heart rate zones aren't so reliable. I guess everybody's heart rates zones are different, and we're going to get into that when we discuss the evolution of the Borg RPE scale. There are certain things like cardiac drift that affect your heart rate while you run. So if you're trying to run to a predetermined heart rate, these things can all basically muddy the waters and make it harder for you to follow the thing you think you should be sticking to.
Yeah, totally agree. Lots of things can artificially, not necessarily artificially, but artificially elevate your heart rate at certain paces you might try to be running at. Whereas RPE, yeah, it's not, stable, but it's going to take that into account. So whereas something like heart rate might not be as reliable. And, not to mention, there's no measurement error in RPE because it is whatever you say it is. Whereas with heart rate, the validity of wrist-based heart rate sensors on your watch, the armbands, unless you're using a chest strap, there might be some inaccuracies in the ways that you're measuring heart rate on a run, also influenced sometimes by the environmental conditions and how fast you're going. So you can get some error in heart rate, and then that could lead you to run a pace that's not correct or appropriate maybe for that given day. Whereas, again, RPE it's not influenced by any of that. It's what you say it is, and there's no instrument that's measuring that correctly or incorrectly.
Exactly. I personally like it because it gives me permission to walk up some steep uphills. I don't feel compelled to try and maintain a specific average pace or whatever. But the other reason I like it is because it kind of promotes this mindset of focusing on the process rather than goals. So I think, we talk about the metrification of running a lot. And as soon as you get wrapped up in following paces and heart rate, which are definitely valid, and for different types of training, it's just what you do. But if you're just running based on your feel on RPE, you're less concerned about what the Strava post at the end of it looks like. You're more focused on, on the goal you've set out to do and the process rather than the objective, I guess you could say.
Yeah, totally. And, I would encourage people, just mentioning Strava. I know a lot of people use it, not every runner, but I would encourage them to use the tool. After your run, it pops up. You're allowed to put a name of the title of your run, but it also allows you to rate it. You can say, was this run easy, medium, hard? I think there are probably just more than 3 ratings on there. I forgot to do it after my run today, but that could encourage you then to just get a feel, not only learn what an RPE is, but you could almost then set the goal of the session to be, I want to press this button on my Strava rating when I come back. It should be moderate. Oftentimes I'm labeling my runs. Like today, I think the title of my run was Easy 10. So, it wasn't 10 miles at 7-minute pace because that wasn't the goal. It was just to run pretty easy and maybe run hard. I had to catch a Strava segment during my run today to get the crown. So I had a little bit of a hard run in there, but mostly it was easy.
Yeah, it's a good nudge for everybody and for me to actually go in and adjust all that Strava stuff. I tend to just let it upload based on, the data. And it thinks I've worn the same shoes for about 2 years, so I need to get in and change that. But shall we discuss, I think we can briefly go through the evolution of RPE. We can talk about the Borg scale, and then we can run through the 1 to 10 scale, which I think is the scale. If you've got any other scales I think worth mentioning, I guess it's a good time to do it. But I think we should focus on the 1 to 10 scale just because I think that's a great scale for, if you ask most people, how do you feel right now on a scale of 1 to 10? most people can give you a decent answer.
I would say so. I think it's probably maybe not the most popular, but in terms of its validity and, 1 to 10 is very common for many people. And so, yeah, I think, at the end of this, we may conclude that a 1 to 10 scale is probably best. I know that everyone kind of has their preference, but I think a 1 to 10 scale, just because we use 1 to 10 scales in so many other areas in life that there's a lot of overlap. So, if you're rating pain or pleasure or tastiness of something, that's on a 1 to 10 scale as well. So RPE kind of makes sense using the 1 to 10 scale. In physiology research, it's the Borg one that is used kind of most often. So maybe we can discuss that scale before maybe moving on to some of the other ones and what they mean. So the Borg scale, originally it's pretty intuitive when you think about it, but now, we'll discuss the limitations of it as well. So it's a 6 to 20 scale. And when a lot of people hear that initially, it's like, huh? Like 6 to 20, that doesn't really make much sense. Why doesn't the scale start at 1? It was originally meant to be based on heart rate or correspond to heart rate during exercise. So theoretically, maybe say the average person has a resting heart rate of 60 beats per minute. So if my RPE was a 6, then tack on a 0 to that, my heart rate maybe is 60. So that maybe is rest. I'm just sitting in my chair right now. I don't know if my heart rate is 60, if it's come down from my run, maybe, but it's probably a bit lower than that right now. But, if you're just walking around during the day, your effort should be baseline. It should be a 6 and your heart rate might be a 60. And then jump to the opposite end of that scale, 220 as the top rating on that scale. Tack on a 0 to that, well, that would correspond to a heart rate of 200. And, theoretically, maybe that's the maximum. You just take a group of 100 people, maybe that's their average maximal heart rate. So then every number in between then, take a 12 on the scale, which is somewhat in between, 120. That would be like your zone 2 intensity maybe for most people. So it's kind of intuitive, and that's why it was developed. It was basically developed to correspond to heart rate from resting to maximal exercise, essentially. It's still fairly commonly used. Where I see it used most is and I've used it several times when administering VO2 max tests. If you go and get a VO2 max test done, you'll typically have the Borg RPE scale used, and by the end of that test, you want to be at an 18 out of 20, and that would indicate you are at maximal exercise. That's actually one of the criteria to indicate that somebody successfully got their VO2 max, is that they said this was at least an 18 on that 18 to 20 scale. And so it works. It's pretty valid, but it actually does require kind of some experience, not only if you're the person asking somebody what their rating of perceived exertion is on that scale, but also if you are the person rating on that scale. I've done, many VO2 max tests, meaning administered them, where the person is on the treadmill and, after even a few minutes, they're like, oh, well, this is a 13. Well, I'm like, well, it's not a 13. And so people sometimes it takes them a while to get, oh, this scale, I should end at a 20. And it's hard to know for them what's increments to jump up on that scale in. So it takes a little bit of learning. That's one of the limitations, I think. Mm-hmm. The other limitation then is that we know that there's just so much variability in everyone's heart rates, and it's not really going to correspond to someone's heart rate like it was originally intended to. If you want me to reach a 20 on the Borg RPE scale, that might be my maximum, except, my maximum heart rate is only 185. So it doesn't really correspond that well to the heart rates necessarily. Maybe that doesn't matter, but it's kind of lost its purpose in that respect. And so, the reason for which it was designed is sort of diverged from, what it actually corresponds to physiologically.
Yeah, it's just intuitively me trying to pick a number between 6 and 20 to describe how hard I'm going. It requires more brain power than 1 to 10. So I think, and I think we call this the modified Borg scale, 1 to 10 or 0 to 10, right? So, like you say, it takes a little bit of practice and familiarity in checking in with the different points on the scale, the descriptions, to make sure that the point on the scale you think you are is where you are. But I think it's an excellent skill for runners to develop, earlier the better, because once you've got it, You've pretty much got it, and it's dialed in your head whenever you're running without any effort, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And again, that's why I would encourage a lot of people to actually, come back from your run and maybe just write down what the run was or put it in your app. That way, even if you never look at it again, which you probably won't, you're at least kind of going through that mental exercise of, oh, I finished that run. And immediately too. You don't wait until tonight, the night of, to rate your morning run, because you have then forgotten how it felt. But right after your run, if you can rate that, you know how you felt, you know what RPE that was. So you kind of have like this referencing. It's just like you're just practicing and learning what an actual, what your RPE is for these various intensities and paces and so on.
Yeah, it's a good point. Following one of our discussions, I've been trying to rate myself like subjective sleep score and motivation score. But unless you do it pretty early in the morning, by like 3 p.m., you've completely forgotten, and I'm just making up numbers.
It's like asking people kind of what they ate the prior week on Sunday. It's like, well, you needed to ask me Monday, like right after breakfast, because by dinner time you've already forgotten what you've eaten. So yeah, for all of these things, the recency bias is the best. You want to rate it right after and before you have all these other factors coming into play. And you're trying to remember, how did I sleep last night? When it's a few days later, that's kind of useless.
100%. Okay, Brady, I'm going to ask you to run us through the 1 to 10 scale of rate of perceived exertion, basically, so everybody listening can either familiarize themselves with it or check in and make sure that they're, maybe when they're ranking their runs, rating their effort, that they're pretty dialed into what is commonly agreed upon as this 1 to 10 scale. So let's start with 1.
Yep.
1 out of 10 RPE.
1 out of 10, this is going to be your minimal effort, almost your resting effort. So it's a gentle walk through the woods, something you could literally just do all day. So I would say for most people, this is just going to be kind of your walking intensity.
Okay, so we're not even running yet. Okay, number 2, or 2 out of 10 RPE.
Yeah, 2 out of 10, I would say for a lot of people, this would be corresponding to a jog. So it's light and easy intensity, not taxing, very gentle, easy to maintain a conversation. You could continue this for hours. So, not quite sitting in a chair, resting, but, you're maybe walking up a gentle incline. Pretty easy.
Okay. 3 out of 10 RPE.
3 out of 10, this is what would be referred to as a comfortable pace. You can maintain a conversation. So if you're using the talk test, you could talk to somebody if you were joined by a partner. And you're not getting out of breath. And this would be, while you're running as well. So you should be able to run while talking at this intensity. A 3 out of 10, that would probably correspond to right around the upper end of zone 2, if we're going to, implement zone 2, not to muddy the waters too much.
No, I think that's useful. And we can maybe also touch on, when we hit them, the RPE values for different races, for different distances. And I'd say this one, if you're maybe running your first ultra or just wanting to finish an ultra, you want to sit at a pace that you can hopefully hold for all day, as long as it takes.
This would be, zone that 3 out of 10, that would be your ultra marathon pace for most people.
Okay, 4 out of 10 RPE.
4 out of 10 is comfortable still, but with some effort. So you're still at a pace where you could hold a conversation, but you're able to get maybe a few sentences, and then you sort of have to take a breath. So still considered to be conversational pace, maybe right at that upper end of zone 2 intensity right here. Even then, probably if we're thinking about racing, still maybe your ultra marathon pace, or maybe into your marathon pace for a marathon that you might not be actually racing all out in this case.
Yeah, comfortable, just finish kind of marathon. 5 out of 10 RPE.
5 out of 10, this would be a progressive pace or progressive effort. So it requires some effort. You can hold a conversation here, but you're going to be, probably taking some breaths right in between words. So it's not quite conversational pace. I think that this would pretty much be your marathon pace, your 5 out of 10.
Okay, so a conditioned runner, something they could hold for 26 miles, in race day, under race day conditions. Okay.
Yep, right. So most people, if you're running a marathon, even at your going for a personal best. You can typically talk to other runners around you during it, but it's not incredibly pleasant.
And what heart rate zone would you say we're in?
This heart rate zone, this would be a zone 3 to lower end of zone 4 intensity.
6 out of 10 RPE.
Yeah, so 6, this is when we get into the hard intensity, hard activity. So your breathing is labored, it's challenging and uncomfortable, something that you could maintain for about an hour, maybe 30 minutes to an hour. So this would maybe correspond to your half marathon pace for, most people aren't running 30 to 60 minutes for the half marathon, but, somewhat of your half marathon pace here.
On race day, you'd be pushing it a bit longer. Okay. 7 out of 10 RPE.
7 out of 10, this is where we get into the vigorous intensity efforts. So you could speak in short sentences, but it would almost sound like you're gasping if you try to talk too much, and it becomes uncomfortable. So this requires your constant effort. It's a pace where you kind of want to stop now. It's becoming pretty uncomfortable. I would say that this probably corresponds to your 10K race pace.
Yeah. The pace at which your brain starts to play tricks on you and tries to convince you it's a good idea to stop. So I know that pace. Okay, 8 out of 10 RPE.
Yeah, 8 out of 10. This would be hard intensity. It requires kind of all your focus to maintain it. Very uncomfortable. You can't get out more than, I'd say, 2 to 3 words at a time. And this will correspond to your 5K pace. Everybody, I think I've posted about this before, but 5K is one of those races that you get scared before racing because you just know that you're going to be in this constant, chronic, burning sensation the entire time. It's like not quite where you're just going to collapse, but it hurts. It hurts the entire time. So that would be your 8 out of 10.
9 out of 10 RPE.
9 out of 10. This is a very hard intensity. So hard, if not impossible to speak. Very labored breathing, and it requires, again, kind of all your mental focus. So this would be your high intensity interval sessions. You're running 400 meter repeats on the track. That's kind of the 9 out of 10 intensity.
Yep. Okay, and then the daddy, 10 out of 10 on RPE, the hardest you can go. Describe it.
Yep, 10 out of 10. That's your all-out sprint as the maximal effort that you can give. You could do this for maybe 20 to 30 seconds. So think of this as your end sprint at the end of a 5K or a 10K or maybe even a marathon, or you're doing 100 meter, 200 meter repeats on the track. That should be a 10 out of 10. And I think, before we maybe move on, just one thing to note about these scales is, of course, that we corresponded them to paces. So, sprinting or 5K or 10K, but a 10 out of 10 effort, even at a slightly slower pace, could be possible, say, at the end of a marathon. Your RPE might be a 10 because you've just run 26 miles. You're only running 10K pace, but of course, it's at the end of a marathon, so it feels like a 10 out of 10. So, of course, there's some nuance there to discuss, but we're kind of talking about these efforts in a so-called fresh state.
Yeah, I guess that's a good distinction. This is kind of, if you're a fairly conditioned runner, this and you're fresh, this is how it would feel. But yeah, running experience would also, a lot of people, their 10 out of 10 effort, if you're just getting going, would be different. And yeah, as you say, just like we discussed, the RPE takes into account so many external factors and internal factors. So, okay, I've got a question for you, Brady. How do you think that a 10-point RPE scale is good? Are there other RPE scales you use or prefer? And is there a case for like just a 3 or 4 point RPE scale?
I think that for most people, 10 is going to be a good scale, but honestly, I think that it introduces almost a few too many numbers for people to rate on. I think what I kind of prefer for myself and for others, even though these are maybe less used and less formal, are, say, maybe a 1 to 3 scale or even a 1 to 5 scale. The 1 to 5 scale, that is going to be not something, original. It kind of would just correspond to your 5-zone training model. But then you could in turn turn those zones into just ratings of perceived exertion or effort levels instead of zones. So your zone 1 is going to be easy. Your 2 is going to be comfortable. Your 3 is going to be, say, progressive, or, steady state. Your 4 is going to be hard. And then your 5 is obviously going to be your all out. And so you could use that. I think that just, again, it introduces less numbers that you have to rate. So less confusion, less effort to rate your effort. It's a little bit more maybe intuitive. And even, using a scale that's more pared down than the 5 zone would just be easy, medium, and hard, just 3. Now, that may be not enough for some people because that essentially, if you're using a rating scale with only 3 different ratings, the gates on those, ratings become wide. So, 2 could span several zones and 3 could span several zones. But I think people need to work out in which rating scales work best for them if you're a coach or if you're a runner. But I really like the 5 zone training model. And so I like an RPE scale that is sort of based on 5 effort ratings. Again, that just goes from, say, easy, comfortable, moderate, hard, and all out. That seems pretty intuitive to me. And it's kind of what I use for myself when I'm thinking about how hard my runs are.
Yeah, that question was actually, I saw a post on X the other day by, I think the guy's name's Brad Culp. He's written a book about the Norwegian training method. And he was basically saying everybody uses too many zones. I think he was proposing, I think he had 4 and he had rest and then 4 zones. And it's a good argument because it's okay. The 1 to 10 is very useful because a lot of people can intuitively give you a number between 1 and 10. But realistically, it's a bit like the gears in your car. Although maybe you drive an automatic, I don't know. But how many gears do you actually need? And when it comes to running, how many different paces are you actually running at? And I guess there's no formal system here, but if you can develop your own system based on the types of running you do, it's maybe advantageous.
I think so too. And I think, a perfect example of why that might be more useful using, say, the 5 zones instead of the 10 is that as we were just describing this 10-point RPE scale, there were several where it was pretty hard for me to distinguish from one to the next. A 1 versus a 2, lots of overlap there. The 5 versus the 6, lots of overlap there. An 8 or a 9, what's the difference between that? So when you pare it down and give someone only 5 options instead of 10, there's a little less nuance, and it's just like, oh yeah, this is definitely a 5, instead of, oh, this could be an 8 or a 9 or a 10, which requires a little bit more, it requires you to think a little bit more. And sometimes the goal of these RPE scales is that they are intuitive and you don't really have to analyze your rating that much. It should just be, I ask you, and it's sort of this reaction response. You really know what effort you're at.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, Brady, we like to explain what the principles and the science of some of these things are, but we also like to give some tips so runners can hopefully improve. And I'm going to ask you, RPE, is there an easy way to just reduce it? So if I go for a run, or are there a few easy ways? If I go for a run tomorrow compared to my run today, is there anything I can be doing that just makes the run feel easier?
There definitely are. So there are, I think, some actual, nutrition things. There are some environmental sort of manipulation techniques. And then there are some psychological things that I think all can help. So psychologically, we know, and a lot of these things have been pretty well studied, but running with music, especially music that you like. I wouldn't say that there's a particular type of music. So it doesn't need to be up-tempo. It doesn't need to be heavy metal, or it doesn't need to be rap. It's music that you like. Running with music that you like is going to make whatever pace you're running at feel easier. As will, for some, unless you're someone who likes to run alone, but running with people. So I guess, if you're running with somebody you like, that will make the run feel easier. If you're running with somebody you don't like, it may make the run feel harder, and you might prefer to be alone. So running with others psychologically too, that generally I think most people would agree, that's going to make the run feel easier. So those are definitely 2 psychological kind of techniques that will reduce your RPE at a given pace. Nutritionally, fueling your run most of the time adequately, so having some carbohydrates before or during. That will reduce your RPE. There's people think about carbs in terms of the fuel that they provide, but there's a huge psychological component to carbohydrates in terms of your body's ability to sense that there's fuel on board and reduce your effort level at whatever pace you're running if you're fueled versus not. So carbohydrates, adequate carbohydrates, hydration is super key. Not feeling thirsty actually is one of the best ways to reduce RPE. So it's not necessarily Alex Hutchinson, I think, has written a lot of interesting stuff on this in his book Endure, but it's not necessarily your level of dehydration that will make a run feel harder and actually reduce your performance, but the sensation of feeling thirsty. So if you can just prevent yourself from feeling thirsty through adequate hydration or maybe just swishing water around in your mouth, that will reduce RPE as well. So those things, nutrition, hydration, obviously, and then cooling. So effort, wearing clothes that either give you the sensation of cooling you or perhaps just wearing fewer clothes overall. Less clothes to feel cooler. That's going to help as well. Maybe bringing a fan along with you or spritzing water on your face or wearing a hat to prevent the UV from getting in your eyes. All of those things, to reduce the perception of heat or actually prevent your body from feeling hot, because as we mentioned, if your body temperature's up, your RPE is going to go up. Those things will also reduce your RPE at different whatever pace as well. So lots of strategies that people can do on runs to lower their RPE.
Yeah, I think it's just about how do you make your run feel easier. And it's interesting you said about the subjective thing about the water or the thirst, whether you actually need to not be dehydrated or whether it's just your sensation and whether you feel dehydrated. But I think a lot of this, in my experience at least, the runs that feel easy are just the runs when I'm in a good mood anyway. So I don't feel any discomfort or niggles. I'm well rested. Usually morning runs feel like twice as easy. Maybe that's a slight over exaggeration, but if I get out in a nice morning and the sun's shining, but it's not too hot yet, and the streets are quiet, it just puts me in a good mood, and the run feels much easier. I definitely agree with the music thing. I don't know if anybody's noted this one before, but I find if I want to go for a good run, I sometimes just take some gum, just some mint gum, and something about that. Especially I would run where it's maybe RPE of 6, 7, 8. It just kind of locks me into a different gear that's easier to maintain somehow. So all these
That's
little
interesting.
tricks.
But in mint gum, you said it has to be mint gum?
Yes, it can't be bubble gum or blueberries. No, it's just mint is the one I've always got, and something about that seems to help.
I think that there's probably something maybe about the sweet taste of that, and maybe something about the minty, like the menthol, in reducing RPE too, or something. So I don't know, but that's interesting. So yeah, a nice tactic. I was going to ask you about things that you used, but that's one that I haven't heard before.
Yeah. What about you? What have you got? Any little hacks that maybe aren't official but seem to work for you?
Yeah, I think the music and the podcasts, I tend to listen to podcasts or audiobooks on my runs, and that will just sometimes take me out of the, just put me in kind of a different place and allow me to sort of lock into the run. That typically helps reduce my RPE. Hydration thing, maybe, but, I would say I don't use gum, but even just carrying a gel out on my run and having like a tiny sip of like a gel or whatever at various time points during my run, I find that to be pretty effective. Just telling the body, like I said before, hey, we have some fuel. You can kind of like reduce your effort at this pace. Other than that, yeah, I find like the biggest thing, just be in a good mood. If I'm set some sort of goal for the workout, that tends to maybe just make it feel a little bit easier. I don't know why, but if I just more have like a purpose versus I'm just going out to get this done, that tends to make it feel a bit easier as well.
I'm trying to think of any others I've come across. I know Kipchoge speaks about the Kipchoge smile, and I think there's been some literature on that, like it does something that makes you feel better, so everything feels a bit easier. I don't know if you come across that.
I haven't. I always thought it sounded good in theory, but I've never read any like studies on it. But it sort of makes sense that if you're I think that almost comes down to the placebo effect a little bit, because it's like, oh, if you know you're trying to force yourself to smile to make this feel easier, then does it actually work? I think that's, an interesting question.
Yeah. Cool. And then I was going to ask you, is there anything over the long run you can do to reduce RPE? But I guess that just gets into training, more training.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, isn't that one of the goals of training in and of itself is, oh, I want to make my pace today, a month from now, I want to make it feel easier. And then, my marathon pace today feels hard, but in a few months when I'm actually racing that marathon, I want it to feel easier than it does today. So yes, training is how to do that. But, Thomas, you and I have spoken about the concept of physiological resilience and durability in previous podcasts. And I think a lot of the training specifically designed to enhance that durability is something that's going to help improve your RPE better at these various paces. So doing progressive long runs or doing these steady state runs that, feel pretty uncomfortable, but you don't quite have to stop due to fatigue, or using some of the practices like we've talked about again in the last few weeks, like deliberate heat training. So taking hot baths, or I saw you yesterday posted something about you went on your run with a jacket on, and I've been running this summer in Texas on some runs, I'll either wear maybe tights or I'll maybe wear a jacket out there. It's heat training, and it's going to make your runs in cooler weather and in hot weather when you're not wearing a jacket. It's going to make those feel a lot easier at the same pace. And so I would encourage people to use strategies like that. Go on hard runs where your effort is artificially elevated, and then that will improve your RPE on runs where you're not trying to artificially elevate it. So I think that comes down to this philosophy of, yes, most of the time we want to do things to make our runs feel easier, but there are certainly times where you want to make your run feel harder so that other runs feel easier. Some runs I'm not going to carry water. I'm not going to carry carbs. I'm not going to have my shirt off. I'm actually going to put more clothes on so that run feels harder. But then when I really want it to count, the run is going to feel easier. So deliberate suffering in the name of reducing RPE, I think, is part of the name of the game a lot of the time.
Well, that was going to be my last question. I've read a little bit of the literature on pain tolerance or pain thresholds, and especially endurance runners and ultra runners tend to have this higher threshold for pain. They can hold their hands in buckets of ice for longer. So I'm guessing those people probably just naturally, if you ask them what their RPE is, they're probably going to report a lower number than somebody that's actually doing the same thing, but doesn't have the same grit or been through the same pain threshold sort of training that these guys do. I don't know if that sounds fair to you, but yeah, I think there must be something there.
I think it does, but paradoxically, maybe that I think that there are probably two types of people. There are people for whom, yes, trained and experienced runners, most runs are just going to feel easier to them. So it might not necessarily be that they're grittier. It's just that, oh, well, you're more well-trained. You're an experienced runner, and therefore running at no matter what pace it is, relatively or absolute, it's going to feel easier. And you're going to rate this session as lower because you're more experienced as a runner versus a non-runner who's like, every run is going to feel like maybe a 6 out of 10. And it just sucks. And that's where they start. But then I think there are a subset of people who either have at the same RPE or a greater RPE, they're just able to they have a high pain tolerance. So they're 8 out of 10. We both might rate something an 8 out of 10, but they're just able to handle that 8 out of 10 better. And I think that's something that comes with training and experience as well, but maybe something that's just innate with that too. Like you said, you're just a grittier person. I would say grit is the ability to tolerate a high RPE, whereas I think somebody who maybe might just be a better runner, that just is going to correspond to a lower RPE. So the gritty is yes, I can hang on to an 8 or a 9 out of 10 for a long time, and those people are just very special, and that might be why somebody's a good runner. Or somebody could be a good runner because they're able to run with a lower RPE at the same pace compared to somebody else. So two different scenarios there, I think.
Yeah, our colleague and buddy Michael, the editor-in-chief of Marathon Handbook, did an interview with Dr. Andrew Jones. And in that interview, towards the end, he talks about Paula Radcliffe, and he talks about how they would do these tests to exhaustion. I don't know, I can't remember the specific test, but the standout quality of Paula Radcliffe was that in every one of these tests, when at the point where Andrew Jones would be used to seeing people say, stop the treadmill now, she would give the hand signal like, I can do one more, I can keep doing one more. And she had just had this grit quality, as we're calling it, that was exceptional.
Yeah, and I think everybody needs to figure out kind of what kind of runner they are. I think some runners thrive on that grit where it's like, man, I can just go at a 9 out of 10 and just grind this out for an hour, and that's how I'm going to be a good runner. And I don't know, maybe Thomas, I don't know what kind of runner you think you are. I think I'm sort of the opposite, whereas I don't really want to learn how to do a 9 out of 10 for as long as I can, but I want to figure out how to make what should be a 9 feel like a 7, and to do that for a long time.
Yeah, I'm happy optimizing my 3 out of 10 most days.
Yeah. I guess, no, that makes sense as well. So rather, maybe you reframed it, I think, in a better way. I want to make your 7, I'm going to make my 7 out of 10 faster versus train myself to hold a 9 out of 10 for as long as I can.
There you go.
So 2 ways of training, same, different paths, 2 different roads to Rome, I guess.
Okay. If anybody that's maybe more of a beginner or isn't familiar with RPE has listened to this, give me a couple of tips. Imagine I haven't done this before and I'm interested in implementing RPE in my training and being aware of it. What would you tell me to do?
First thing, I would say, when you go out on your run for the next few weeks, take, at halfway an assessment, maybe, a third way through, halfway through, and then near the very end. Take an assessment, just give yourself a rating out of 1 through 10. How hard does this feel? Again, go through the practice of knowing what different RPEs feel like. And then afterwards, use those tools. Like we said, most runners are using apps these days, like Garmin, Strava, Coros, whatever. All of these have rating scales. Rate your runs, and it'll just, again, put you through that practice of corresponding your runs to how hard you think they should feel. So that's one thing that I would encourage people to do. Second would be to, if you're used to prescribing your runs based on pace or heart rate, prescribe them based on RPE. Maybe not every single session, but a few sessions per week. Don't say, oh, I want to run, 8 minutes per mile, 9 minutes per mile this week, but I want to run, this run should be a 7 out of 10, and just try to hold that the entire time. And don't pay attention to your pace, but just pay attention to your subjective effort during that run. I think those would be 2 things that people could do just to get more in tune with their body and training and using these different RPE scales. And then lastly, I think I would say experiment with different scales to see which one you like the most. We've talked about several today, 1 through 10. There's the 1 through 5, and then there's the 6 through 20 even that you could use. So maybe try to rate your runs using these different scales to see which one you actually might want to implement into your training.
Thank you. And I would almost say the goal here isn't to completely ignore pace or heart rate or any of these variables, but it's to get a more intuitive sense of how you're running and what your effort is. And then you can kind of integrate the whole thing, because I can usually get a pretty good feel for, okay, I know what my RPE is, and I can usually tell you pretty specifically how fast I'm running and how fast I'm running compared to other days. So I think it's not saying adopt RPE and ignore your watch. It's kind of saying integrate it, and it allows you to be less reliant on data.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think either of us would encourage people to ditch things like heart rate or pace, but use everything. We have all of these tools available. I think the lesson learned, and this just goes back to that wonderful piece that Alex Hutchinson wrote about the NASA scales and the different training stress scores. It wasn't that you need to use the training stress scores all the time or never use them. It wasn't that this NASA questionnaire should be used for everything, but there are days when training stress score will be great. There are days when you should use RPE. You need to learn how to integrate all of these into your training, and I think that's gonna, what's going to lead to the best outcome for sure.
Okay, Brady, I'm going to change the gear because we're actually recording this on the day of the Breaking4 event, which is Nike's event in Paris, where they're going to get Faith Kipyegon to hopefully be the first woman to run a sub 4-minute mile. Now, the odds, I would say, are stacked against her. She holds the world record at 4:07 and something, but Nike are throwing tons of tech and new fancy pacing strategies and stuff at this. So I want your prediction. What time do you think she's going to run?
I think we're going to see a world record, but I don't think that we're going to see sub 4. The leap is just so profound from the 4:07 to a sub 4 right now. So my prediction is somewhere between a 4:03 and a 4:04. I think she'll take a few seconds off just with the tech, with the pacing. I think that's inevitable unless there's a real blow up. So I think we'll see a world record, but I don't think that she will break 4.
Unfortunately, and this might not age well, hopefully it doesn't age well, because I don't think she's going to do it either. If you look, just looking at the numbers, I mean, she ran that world record in 2023. Before then, the record was 5 seconds slower. So she took almost 5 seconds, I think, off a world record by Sifan Hassan from 2019, I believe, which was 4:12, I believe. But there had been a slightly slower 4:12 run in 1996. So the sort of progression of this record is much like the progression of many of these records. It's been people shaving off less than a second when they break a record. And then Kipyegon came in 2 years ago and shaved off 5 seconds in one fell swoop. So then to make another leap for another 8 seconds is pretty audacious. Having said that, I do think it's an exciting event, and Nike's got so much interesting stuff going on that I'm not ruling it out. I'm all in. I'm keen to see what happens, and I'm not ruling out sub 4 mile. I do hope it happens.
I think everybody hopes it happens for sure. There are skeptics, but I think they're skeptics for the right reasons. It's a very audacious goal, but yeah, we'll see. And yeah, I guess props to Nike for, some people, are not everybody is for, kind of what Nike is and their monopoly maybe in the running world. But I think that what they're doing to promote kind of stuff like this is cool and get people excited about the sport of running. So I'm all for it. And we'll tune in about 2 hours from now.
It almost feels like the sort of, like when you see a new spaceship launch for the first time or something like that. Like it's a proper moonshot. It is something that is actually inspiring. So we'll see.
Absolutely. Yep. I'll be tuning in.
Okay, Brady, thanks as always for the information and discussion on RPE. I'm sure people will get something out of that. Until next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas.
Okay. Cheers.